And I'm going to invite Sam back again to introduce our guest relation today. Sam, you with us?
Yes. Hello, relatives. Sorry for the technical difficulties. This is Sam, she, her, Ute Nation, and it's my honor to introduce Alan Lechusza Aquallo. He's Luiseño Nation and Maidu. And the way that I got to know about Alan is one of my congregation members had an anti-racism, anti-oppression virtual theater, and Alan created a virtual gallery filled with his own writing, images, and music. And this virtual gallery was called This Is Not Indian Country. So we'll put the link in the chat for that. And it just blew my mind. So, you know, as we go along in Indian country and in our lives, sometimes we get to see glimpses here and there of each other or in the media. And it's not anything regular unless you're watching specific Native media online. And when you see another relative's indigeneity, it's just inspiring. And Alan's indigeneity just was so inspiring to me. And I was looking at what he did, and I told my congregation member, I'd like to meet this person. And he said, sure. So he connected me and Alan, and then I began talking about this idea where I just wish there was more and more platforms, spaces where we can hear Indigenous voices. And we came up with Unlearning Sessions, and then we launched in September and went through until we ran out of funding in February of this year, 2022. So we started last year, September 2021. But it was a beautiful journey because we had a lot of conversations before we got there. So Alan is infinitely just mind-blowing to me. I learn every time we talk. I love the stories he shares and the way that he gives from his heart for the people. And he has just been wonderful to know and to continue on this journey with. And I am continuing to learn more about my own indigeneity, just being in spaces with each other. So it's an honor to introduce Alan Lechusza Aquallo. Alan, you can take it from here.
Hello, everybody. Ahoma Takwes, all my relations, Paxiom. Let's see, what else could I say? Usoy, Ohoy. So there, I said it in at least 3 to 4 different languages. So hello, Alan Lechusza Aquallo. I'm Luiseño and Maidu, and thank you all for being here and sharing this kind of time. I know it's a busy session for everybody. When I was growing up, I lived in a very, very, very poor area. I lived on and off the reservation until I was 5 years old, the Luiseño Reservation. And then we left. We left for specific reasons that I later in my life were able to find out and been trying to like put back together. But we left. And so it was a long journey for me to kind of go back to the res, because I was always told and growing up, especially through like grade school and stuff, you know, to be a real Indian, you got to be from the res, you know, you got to have that. And that was kind of weird because it set a little bit different from what my grandma, I remember her telling me. She said, you know, Hijo, you can be Indian in the house, but when you're out in public, you know, you got to be somebody else. You got to blend in. And it was weird for me because I don't look like anybody else in my family. And so that was kind of a very strange bend, because everybody in my family's got, you know, like they're really dark complected and, you know, the stereotypical Indian look, right? And I got this whole different complexion where I'm a lot lighter. You know, my hair was never as dark or anything, but I grew longer hair than my cousins, all of them. So, hey. But anyway, but my grandma always, you know, she said, oh, he's that northern kid. You know, he's got all that northern blood. And I was always blown away by that. I was like, what the heck do you mean? And as life went on, I never knew, because I was always told that we were just Liseño. And then later on in life, my mom even said, no. She said, we're Liseño and Maidu. We had Northern blood. And I remember asking my grandma, I was like, is that what you mean? And she said, yeah. She said, you got all that Northern blood. She said, yeah, that's just you. And it was really strange, because I grew up in a place where it was a total trippy world, where you had, like, I didn't see a person with fair skin or blonde hair until I went to college, and it blew my mind. And my dorm was probably bigger than the size of the city I went to or grew up in. It was really poor. So you had Mexicans, you had blacks, and then you had us. We were the only Indian family in town, but we were told not to be Indian outside. You're not to be Indian, and it was a lot of it because of the punishment. We all went to boarding schools. I went to the same boarding school that lost its status that my mom did when she was growing up. And it was really weird, because the town actually was built around the boarding school so the kids could work in the fields, and then they could do that. And as a kid, I worked in those same fields. That's how I helped pay for the family. But it was always strange. She always said, you're that Northern kid. You got all that Northern blood. And my cousins would beat up on me and everything and say, you don't look like us, no, you're not Indian, and all those kind of nagging things that we would do, right? So it was very confusing for me. I just kept arguing, am I Indian? Am I not? I don't, what's going on? And later on in life, I was at a conference, and I got contacted by a guy from the Maidu Nation who's going to be at the conference. And when I walked through the doors and turned the corner, he came running up to me. He said, "Nephew," and he grabbed me. I mean, this guy, and he was huge, right? He's a big, brawly guy, and I'm small. So he grabbed me and picked me up off the floor, gave me this big bear hug, and said, "Where have you been?" And I looked around and said, "Oh my God, you all look like me, or rather, I look like you." And he's like, he said, "Yeah." He said, "You got to come back up, all this stuff." And I explained to him what was going on growing up, and he said, "That's very common, with where you were in particular, because." We had to be Mexican if we were at school, but I didn't look Mexican. You could be Indian in the house, but I didn't look like anybody else. And then, I tried to blend in with being white, but I had all these different views of, how, white supremacy and white Orthodox, mannerisms and civilization was developed. So I was totally confused. And then I met my uncle. And it really connected, and I was able to piece together, through talking with other relations from up north, that it's just who we are. Indians come in all different sizes, shapes, shades, everything. And so there's not one size or shoe or moccasin, rather, tongue in cheek, that fits any Indian. And it was really mind blowing, and I never forgot that. And then anytime we were around, I didn't have to say anything. And my uncle would just come up to me, and I just remember, he would always give me the big bear hug, lift me up, "Nephew, where have you been? You got to come back, do the deer dance, do all these kinds of things." Because I was always raised up in a powwow culture. But you could be Indian only when Indians were around. You couldn't be Indian elsewhere. So it was very odd to have to hide your identity, the transparent Indian. So it was, are you Indian or are you not Indian? What are you? And at school, because it's a boarding school, you were not to say you were Indian, because they would physically beat you up. And it was true. I mean, I remember getting beat up because I, said to a bunch of school kids, I'm Indian. And the kids just beat the crap out of me, excuse my language. And the teachers didn't do anything. I'm the one that got punished because I expressed that I was Indian. And the other kids who tore me a new one didn't get punished at all. So it was kind of strange. And then one afternoon, I was with my grandparents because my mom tried to raise me as traditional as she could. So my uncles raised me, and she was a single mom, right? So we worked in the fields. We, garbage dumped for food and scraps and, whatever we could do and everything. It was really poor. And so I spent a lot of time with my grandma and grandpa, and they're the ones who raised and cared for me, as well as my uncles. They're the ones who taught me the way, and taught me Indian way without me knowing it. They were very, very slick about it. And it wasn't until later in life that I understood that that's what they were doing. But my grandpa went and got the mail, and he came in and he opened up this stuff and he opened up this one letter, and he just paused and just kept staring at it and looking at it and reading it. And I remember asking him, I was like, what does it say, Gramps? What's it say, Papa? And he said, he looked at me and said, "Hijo, we're no longer Indian." I said, "What the heck does that mean?" And he said, "Here." He said, "This proves we're no longer Indian." And it was from the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that because we lived off the reservation for so long, and we didn't have that kind of contact or tie anymore, that we were disenfranchised. And the reason I found out later that we left is because my grandpa got in a big argument with somebody on the tribal council. So that's why we moved. And then we literally moved overnight. And I was a baby. I was just about 5 when we did. But literally packed up the car and just drove, and whatever home was free, that we went to, that's where we settled. It was a really hard life. And so the tribal council worked hard in all those years, and they let his lapse of tribal contact go away. And we actually had the federal paper that noted that we were disenfranchised. We were no longer federally recognized as Indian. And so legally that meant that only half of me was Indian. And later on, I just kept thinking, well, what half is Indian then? Is it my upper half? Is it my left half? My right half? Have I been expressing the wrong half all this life? What's going on? But I remember that, with the bacon crackling in the background and the smell of the pancakes that my grandma was making, and my grandpa just standing there staring at this piece of paper. And he never looked at the mail. He hated the mail. But I remember him staring at this paper, and he said, we're no longer Indian. And it took my mom years later, when we were at her little home near the reservation where she moved back after she retired, before she passed away, her telling me and kind of explaining the whole process of what was going on and what had happened. And it was just so weird that overnight we literally woke up. We went to bed being 100% Indian, but woke up by federal recognition to only being partial. And so I cannot legally, this is the trip, I cannot legally acknowledge half of my bloodline. It's very strange. So growing up in an urban environment and growing up being Indian, not Indian, had, multiple factions and multiple franchisements. And later, I learned about, the largest Indian tribe in the country. It's, it's the urban Indian population. And I had to learn how to unravel all the mysteries of what it is to be an Indian in the 21st century. Fascinating. Okay, Sam, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Alan. I always appreciate listening to you, and another relative I love listening to is Aspen. So I would like to invite next our co-facilitator Aspen Basaldua to please come off mute and share. And please, would you pronounce your last name? I apologize, but I think I just butchered it.
Basaldua. Hello, everyone. My name is Aspen Basaldua. I am coming to you from my ancestral lands of the Carrizo-Comecrudo tribe, or Eshtokna, which in English means of human people. I would like to read you this quote, and because my story in this group is a very, very different one, because you will hear other stories of heritage and knowing their heritage and having their history. But I come from an area called the Rio Grande Valley on the U.S. Mexico border, where all our history was wiped out by the Spanish, by the Texans, and by the United States government. And so I'll read you this. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. That was written by Gloria E. Antaldua, who's one of the most prolific writers of our region. It comes from her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the new Mestiza. And Antaldua is where I start understanding who I am, because Antaldua was this little chicanita queer woman who, gave us language about being queer and being indigenous and being who we are. Because before we didn't know, because the way things were done here was we were once, taken over by the Spanish government, then Mexicans. Then after the Mexican-American War, our land was annexed in 1848 into the United States. And so, unlike every other cavalry, the cavalry in Texas, with the accompaniment of the Texas Rangers, worked aggressively to eradicate indigenous peoples and history. So my people, the Carrizo Comicrudo, chose to go underground, to become Mexican rather than go to boarding schools or rather than die. But prior to that, there was the missions. The missions were where they took us at the beginning. The Spanish took us to San Antonio, other places, gave us new names, and said, your name is now Juan, and that is your name. And so growing up, I didn't have any of the verbiage about who I was, because my mother had grown up in Utah, Orem, Utah, had been raised in a predominantly white community as a Mormon. So I'm also an ex-Mormon. And my grandmother, her mother, really didn't talk about her upbringing, and it's totally different than mine, because she grew up in a more upper middle class family than, say, myself. And then my grandfather, he is from southern Mexico. He was born in Baja California, and lived in what is the state of Nayarit in southern Mexico. So I have that southern Mexican heritage. The only thing I knew growing up about being indigenous was that my grandfather's late mother, who was alive when I was a child and died fairly recently, was Native. Native, we don't know, because her mother died when she was a child, and her father was from Spain and went blind in his early age. So her tia took care of her on her father's side. So, I remember growing up, my paternal grandmother saying, yeah, my grandfather was an Indian. And I didn't exactly know what that meant. It wasn't until picking up Borderlands that I know that I was a part of a people who had to assimilate into not just being Americans, not just being Mexicans, but being an entirely different people, because our identity would never line up with the rest of the world. My area is 95% Latinx or Mexican American. Many of our people have lived here since the Spanish land grants of the 17th century, but you will never know the difference between them being from here or Mexico, because we're a border culture. So we live side by side in our Mexican heritage, because we're right near the border, the Rio Grande, which my people, the Carrizo, believe that's where all life started, in the Rio Grande. We call that a matome, or spirit river. And our relatives went from the canyons up in West Texas all the way to Monterrey, Mexico. And so we lost contact with our northern relatives in northern Mexico. But luckily we do have some members, and are currently located in Floresville, Texas, which is near San Antonio. And yeah, so, and it's also, even more of a difficult upbringing, because, I had to throw away the baggage of being Mormon, being raised in a faith that said my skin color was the product of sin and a curse. My people were ancient Israelites who disobeyed God, so our skin was turned brown. Something I'm still deconstructing, because it was never addressed as racist when I was little. It was just how it was. And so, we're now, as I'm older, I have been working harder to learn about these things. It wasn't until I became a Unitarian Universalist anyways, yes, so I've just been given the signal that I need to wrap up. So I'm going to wrap
No,
up.
that's not the signal. I was telling you you had 9 more minutes. So you were
Okay.
saying is as you became a Unitarian Universalist.
Okay, yes. As I became a Unitarian Universalist, I really started embracing indigeneity. The way I became a UU was quite interesting. I walked into my philosophy professor's office. She was a logician trained at BC, Boston College. And I told her I was looking for a religion that wasn't too preachy, that would let me believe what I wanted. And she said, "You're talking about Unitarian Universalism." And she said, "Yeah, there's a fellowship here in a place in San Juan, Texas, which I am a member of Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hidalgo County, which was a byproduct of the fellowship movement. Our church was founded in a room in a house by academics in 1958. So we're still true to the core, fellowship Unitarians, to the point where lay-led. We're not like religious, like the mention of God in my community is like a no-no, because that's how atheistic we are. And so it was hard to reconcile a lot of these beliefs because one, I wasn't a theist. I am not a theist. I identify myself as a religious naturalist or a non-theistic pagan. And so it's been a struggle to understand, can I still be native and not believe in the supernatural, not believe in creator or creators? And, I still think I can be. And I know I can be, because it's not about, my spirituality that makes me native. It's not about my language. It's about where I was born and the blood within my veins that is native. So, I view being native sort of like the way that our Jewish relatives are, who, they are an ethnic community as well as their ethnicity is tied with their spirituality. So I think the natural progression of our people, many natives still believe they're native. We'll still say our prayers and do our ceremonies, but to us, they're the symbols and a part of our culture. They're not, we don't literally believe that, we're going to bring the rain. But if we rain dance or we sing our rain songs in the summertime, we're practicing things that gave our people hope and gave our people the nourishment they needed. And so I have been reconciling and rebuilding that for the last give or take 6 years that 5-6 years I've been in this space. And I've come to realize that to walk the red road, as is a cliche that some say from the Lakota Nation, it's not an easy road, but it's my red road. And my red road, can be narrow, it can be wide, it can be horizontal, it can be vertical, but it's mine. And so if my red road is me practicing neo-pagan traditions and casting circles and identifying as a naturalist or a religious naturalist and not embodying or engendering theism, then so be it. That's my red road. And I'm going to continue walking that as long as I'm alive, as long as I can keep living this way. Because every day I wake up, I look in the mirror and I say, I'm the one they did not kill. I'm the Indian that they could not kill. My relatives, went through so much, losing their language, coming to a new country, and having to change overnight so they could be in this mold. But I'll never be in this mold. I'm from the border. I'm a border person. So if I move to California, if I move to Chicago, or I move all the way to like England, I will still be from the border, because that is my culture. That is my history. I will still be both Mexican, American, Indigenous, all in one, because that is not something I can ever separate. Land cannot separate me. Time cannot separate me, because that is who I am. And that's who my people have become. So, I would hope one day some of you could come to the Valley and experience the most biodiverse region in the United States, and experience our culture and who we are as people, and just learn more, because our region has been at the forefront of the family separation movement, asylum seekers, we're at the forefront of the border militarization. I grew up in a militarized environment. And as a person of faith and a person of Indigenous heritage, and as a person who wishes to undo capitalism and to make a better world, I can tell you that a part of my experience is learning that borders don't define me. The region that I'm from is on Turtle Island. The real immigrants are the people who came in their boats, sailed up the Rio Grande, and found my people. They're the real immigrants, not me. I may look brown, I may be Indigenous, but that's no matter where I'm at, this is my home. This is my land. This is where my people are from. You cannot take that away from me. It's not possible. The only way you could take that away from me is, by ending me in some way. But hopefully that never happens. But that's truly what it is. We have to reconstruct and deconstruct who we are. And I hope in this panels that we will do in the coming future, you will see what it is like to be a 21st century Native and what that means in different perspectives, because mine is one of many. Kia's and Sam's are one of many. And we don't all agree. We'll never all agree. But one thing we can agree on is we are people of the earth, and sharing these stories is our duty to our ancestors and our duty to the world. Thank you. Now I'd like to welcome our other co-facilitator, Sam Beltram.
Oh, thank you for those words, Aspen and Alan. I'm just really so touched with what I've heard, and I'd like to say too for myself, I want to also acknowledge that as you can see, I am a screenshot, right? You're seeing a picture, so I'm joining on a flip phone through dial-in, an old school phone call, and I love everything about that. I love that in these spaces we can create accessibility like that, so that you don't have to have a fancy phone. You can call an old-fashioned phone call, and it's fine. So I want to acknowledge that, and I'll begin my sharing by saying, I was born in Sacramento, and in other words, urban Indian setting, right? Native experience living in the city, a big city, and much of my family was in Sacramento, all throughout, east, west, north, south, and the way that we got there is my great grandma. She started out in Colorado, and her first husband was killed, so she remarried and came out here. She came out to Sacramento, to California from Colorado. And in that process, as we've heard other relatives say, I'm just kind of blown away by some of the similarities. My great grandmother, my maternal great grandmother, she had instructions for her siblings, or for her children, excuse me, and so my grandmother's generation grew up with instructions that you don't worry about what tribal language I'm speaking. Speak English. That's what they want you to speak. And she said, and if they ask what you are, you tell them you're American. It's the truth. And that always stuck with me, hearing these family stories, and you go through life as a Native in the urban setting, so many questions I think rolling through, and like, wow, I thought those instructions were meant so that we could survive, because it wasn't okay to be Indian. The other story I remember hearing is before she moved to California, there were signs and windows, and maybe even on the journey on the way to California, and these signs read things like, no Indian, or no dogs would come first. No dogs and no Indians allowed in the store. So, talk about communicating a subjugated status, a status of, you can't bring your dogs in here, and the Indians aren't allowed in here either. So I'm hearing these stories as I'm growing up and going, wow, and then that came from my grandmother's generation and continued, it seems to me, into my mother's generation, where she would say, I'm American. And I would hear her later say, you know, I'm Native American or American Indian. But this the training, right? The training of survival. We do not say we're Indian. You do not say you're Native American when you're out in public. And to know you're in an environment where that's being done for your safety, you're not safe if you say what you are. And I remember also my grandmother, she loved to, she just, I'm the firstborn grandchild, so that's a special designation, but she's one of my favorite members of the family. She's passed now, but she would just drill into me every conversation. Before we'd end it, somewhere in the conversation, she made sure she put in, you can pray to God anywhere. It does not need to be in a building. You can pray to the Creator anywhere. So I would say, yes, Grandma, and she'd say, I want to know that you remember that. Yes, Grandma, I remember that. So growing up with these Native teachings, but they weren't, like that was one example where that wasn't explicitly expressed as this is from our tribe. I am teaching you this from our people. And even coming down to my mother's generation, my mother instructed me on the importance of being kind to animals. Plants could help you heal. And I remember her teaching me when I hit puberty about makeup, that this is not a way for us, that this is, you only use it on special occasions and it should not be visible on your face. People should see your features when you're wearing makeup, not the makeup colors. So this is the tribal values being taught, but very coded, not as this is what our tribe is taught. You know, this is from our people. I remember asking my mom one time too, what tribe are we? And she didn't know. She said, well, maybe we're Paiute. I don't know. It wasn't until my grandma was on her deathbed that I learned that we are Ute. So just to give you an idea of an experience where, as an urban Indian, when a family does things for survival and then things are coded or we're not able to talk about who we are, how that can even translate down generations into not knowing what tribe you are. And I'm not sure why my grandma didn't tell everyone until her deathbed, but I was grateful that she told me. And the only other thing I want to add into this before I close, or as I'm closing, is that the urban Indian experience is not one you hear much. So I love stories like Home to Medicine Mountain that show how our ceremonies are, right, for different tribes. And we'll put in the chat as well, Mel and the Blue Arrow. That is an urban Indian story. And we don't hear much of those because our ceremonies, as Aspen said, we have different perspectives. And the ceremonial life that I come from and the ways that I know, they're real. It's not symbolic for me. If we're doing a ceremony to heal the land and heal the people, it's doing what we came to do, because that is the power of the medicine. That is the way. So I just want to share that in my closing and say aho. And I would like to invite another amazing and inspiring person that I love to listen to, my co-facilitator, Kia Bordner.
The birds are very talkative, so they will join in as we go along. Be grateful they're not my grandmother's parrot. Nakute nakute takaman, or long, long ago, therefore it is so. Achai taha em chani avo, inepo kia tayak, inepo San Diego po hoak. My name is Kia. I live in San Diego. In community with other Yoemi, I am learning and reclaiming Yoemi, the language of the Yoemi Nation, also known as Yaqui. And in order for me to strengthen my understanding and connection to this part of my culture, and to decolonize not only how non-Indigenous folk view me, but also how I present myself, I'm trying to get into the habit of using the phrases and the words that I have learned. Nakute Nakute Takaman is a traditional storytelling opening that comes from my Tigwa culture. Many years ago, I was able to begin to learn and reclaim some of the Southern Tiwa language as another part of my identity. I am the granddaughter of Juan Crisostomo Renteria of the Tigwa people of Isleta del Sur, of Maria Teresa Baca, whose nation has been lost to colonization, of the Monteverdes of the Yoemi Yaqui people, and of the Mayers of Germany. I'm also the mother of 4 adult children, Elizabeth, Sarah, Julia, and Ryle. Nakute Nakute Takaman, or long, long ago, therefore it is so. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. The children of a family, the siblings and the cousins, that youngest generation were outside playing, and the mothers and the aunts and the grandmother were sitting nearby working on various chores, and they were talking and laughing as they worked. And one of the young grandchildren ran up and asked the grandmother, what does that word mean that you just said? Hush, it is gibberish. Habla español. The grandmother waved off the curious child, who shrugged and went back to playing. The women in the family had been speaking to each other in the language of their mothers and their grandmothers. But this grandmother made the heartbreaking decision not to share this language with her grandchildren. She insisted to them, nosotros somos mexicanos, no indias. How does obsidian forget the hiss of magma? How does water forget the cloud of its birth? Nakute Nakute Takaman, now maybe 50 years later, so not as long ago. Remember the sun's birth at dawn? That is the strongest point of time. Now, one of the grandmother's grandchildren had grown up and was herself a grandmother, and she told that story to her grandchildren of how her generation had been forced to speak Spanish and not understand or learn the language that the adults were speaking. Can wild iris forget the dark belly of the bulb? Does scar forget the torn raw edge of flesh? Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Nakute Nakute Takaman. Now it's another 20 years, so again, not that long ago. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. My grandmother, who had been taught to speak Spanish instead of the language of our people, became a ancestor. And this grandchild learned that our great-great-grandmother had left the homeland of our people and moved our family to a town where they weren't known, where they could be Mexican, not Indian, and where her grandchildren would be safe from the residential schools. Hands that reached deep inside chaos brought me out into the world. Mouth that breathed into mine a language wild enough to wake me. Nakute Nakute Takaman. Maybe it's now, or maybe sometime in the future. Which of us can tell, because time is not linear. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Remember the plants, trees, animal life. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. And as the granddaughter of these grandmothers whose stories and choices and sacrifice allow me to be here today to tell my stories and their stories. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and the universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. I honor my grandmothers with my work to help birth a new world into being, a world where no grandmothers have to choose between their homelands, their languages, their cultures, and their faiths to ensure that they have grandchildren and have a chance to have great-grandchildren? When does fire forget lightning? Should canyon forget river? Might skin renounce fingerprint? Will honey deny the bee? Remember that language comes from this. Remember the dance language is that life is. Remember. Don't ask me to forget. Don't tell me this is over. Beneath sand and broken mountains, even the Mojave remembers salt of a fickle sea. So these are some of the stories of my grandparents, and I'm a storyteller. It's part of my Indigenous identity. And when we end a story with the Tigua, we say Kakweksi, meaning you have a tale. And it's so important to me, and as you've heard all of our stories, but that we can reclaim and learn our languages, that we can share these stories, that we can understand how much so many of our ancestors went through and the decisions, that really painful choices, because that grandmother decided to disconnect from the culture so that they could pass as something other than Indians and not get taken to the residential schools. Yes, they lived and had children and had grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but we don't have that connection. I only learned the name of my great-grandmother's people when my grandmother died and I saw her birth certificate, because her whole life, my whole life, the story had been that she was from El Paso, which is very close to where my Tigua grandfather's people and reservation are. But they weren't Tigua, they were Mexican. And it was upon seeing her death certificate and where she was born that I was able to research and realize that she had come from an entirely different community that we have no connection to. So we thank you for the first part of our conversation, which was listening to the stories of our co-facilitators and our guests. The second part of this, because this is an unlearning conversation, is to now open this up to a conversation with the rest of you. If there were particular, for me, I took down some notes. There were a couple things that really stood out. That one, there's a lot of this story of passing in order to survive, to even if it was just not to get beat up, right? But also to make sure you lived. A lot of loss of language and culture and living where our people come from. And that's a discussion for another day, that Indigenous people believe that we came from that land, that the trees and the mountains, like those are ancestors. And then, a couple of us learned a lot of the details about who we were and where we came from as adults, or after after relatives were dead or dying, and now you don't have that resource. And then that what Sam was talking about, that no dogs are Indians, like that idea that Indigenous people were not even people, we're on the level of animals. And I do see that folks, if you have to leave, that's fine. These are recorded. And as we've said, there's no, not attending one session doesn't mean you can't come to another. They're all unique conversations. So we will open this to questions and have a conversation around what you all want to talk about, what you've heard from us. Karen, if you want to ask or say anything before you, Karen, if you want to ask or say anything before you go, I invite you to do that.
Mostly I'm just feeling such gratitude for the story shared, and the variety of perspectives and ways. I'm just thinking about the ways that different people interacted with uncles and grandmothers, and parents, and grateful for that. So thank you.
So good to have you here with us today.
Let's see you later.
Aspen, did you have a thought? Oh, I see that Dan has raised a hand.
I don't want to interrupt if Aspen was
No,
about
no, no,
to speak.
no. If you were going to say something, I was going to point out that you were raising your hand. But go ahead.
I simply raised my hand for now to express my awe, my respect for the forthright way. I really love that there are young people here. Aspen, I assume you're younger than I am. I'm 65. And Alan Lechusza Aquallo sounded also a very young voice. And it's really wonderful that you're representing. Thank you. Just thank you so much for the courage and forthrightness and honestly willingness to share your story with people you don't know. I'm honored.
You're most welcome. It is in all native lifeways that we share our history with everyone we meet, because it's a Western concept just to say my name is George, I'm from Kentucky or something like that. No, when we introduced ourselves, even though we didn't speak the same languages, we would go and say, my name is so and so of so and so nation. Michelle, you got a question?
Well, I have a comment. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have hunted. Hi, Kia. I have hunted for so long to find this one. Okay, I'm phenotypically white. I am genotypically mixed. I am Cherokee, but I'm also Creek, Choctaw, and Lakota. Have the Dawes, have the Bakers, have never stepped up to become a member of the Cherokee Nation. I promised myself I wouldn't do it unless they needed the numbers. I am learning Cherokee because my grandmother and my great-grandmother, both my mom and dad's side, spoke because they both had Cherokee, and they never let anybody. There are a lot of stories, but in 1992 or 93 on NPR, there was a piece. I've hunted for so long, and I still look regularly in the archives, where this group of researchers some are from Germany, some from the United States, got together with leaders from quite a few nations. And when they started this, the researchers started by saying their names and what their degrees were. And the leaders from the different nations stopped them and said, no, that's not how you introduce yourself, because that doesn't tell us who you are. And it's not you acknowledging who you are and where you came from. And then each one of them introduced themselves and told about their family names, who they came from, where they came from, their lands. And by the end of it, and in this recording, it's so amazing, every researcher is sobbing because they've learned that they've been so disconnected from all of their roots, and they only had the Western concept of who you are in time now and what you've produced or what degrees you have. And if I can ever find that, Kia, I will share it with you so that you can share it. But I still hunt on a regular basis because I wish I had to say that, Aspen, because this is directly to that. And yours really, yes, very much touched me because the land is part of who you are. But that's just what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you. It's very hard for Westerners to understand, especially people in the Anglophone world, because outside of Anglo culture, you go to French people, you go to Spanish people, their languages are contextual. So they have feeling, they have a sort of warmth to them. But in English, the way English developed, it's a decontextualized language. So that's why in English, when you say hello, well, in Spanish, there are at least 5 different ways to say hello. And in indigenous languages, words would change by season. So like in terms of like snow had a different name depending on what it looked like, depending on what time of the winter it was, and all of that. And the thing is that for myself, I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I grew up hearing it. And the thing is, I have often find it hard to communicate what I want to communicate in the English language, because English does not allow for that deeper connection to the concept and to what you're speaking, because the language is in the land. The language is a part of everything. And that's why we natives say when our language dies, our people die with it, because we didn't write things down. We kept our language. Our stories are in our language. So if someone, the last fluent speakers of my language were last recorded in 1845. We only have one living speaker, and that's our tribal chairman of our language. So when he dies, if his kids don't learn it, and our language will be gone. There will be no more of our language. Potonami, the language of my people, will be dead. And that is unfortunate, but that is, very common, and it's a sad thing. That's why when we Indigenous say learning our language is important. Language schools, like, if you ever see a fund saying we need funds to fund a language school for like the Choctaw Nation or other nations, give the money to them there, because that's vital to their cultural survival. That's vital to them maintaining their ceremonies and their heritage and knowing where they came from.
Yeah, I was so fortunate to find through Facebook, through a couple friends who are Yoemi Yaqui, and one posted that there was going to be a language thing online. And so, it's right now it's a professor out of UCLA who is Yaqui. Right now he's on a sabbatical, but it was so great because I wasn't just learning from a book. It's a group of folks, and it's a community, and the context. So the greeting in Yoemi literally says, "May Creator bless you." It's not even hello. It is you greet someone with blessings on them. And then when I said where I lived, Inepo, San Diego, Po, Hoak, Po at the end of the word, the way that the professor explained this is anywhere that Yoemi is, anywhere that a Yoemi is Yoemi land. So we add Po to the end, that contextualizing that I am part of where I live now. Not just that I live there and I exist there, but it now has been influenced by my existing there as a Yoemi. Sam,
Kat had a question.
You have a question?
In the chat saying what are our relationships to our tribe.
So I wanted
Sam, Alan, feel free to chime in.
I wanted to ask Alan and Sam if they wanted to address the topic of language before we got to that question.
Okay.
That's okay. So so Sam or Alan, if you want to address language and that.
Sure. So for me, I would just refer back to what I shared in my lived experience and the family history with my maternal great-grandmother wanting to make sure that she would have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, as you so beautifully put in your story, Kia, and your sharing. The saying, speak English, is what they want you to speak. What that translates into through the generations in my lived experience, my family history, is the children, my grandmother's generation, not learning the language. As far as I know, my grandmother never, I have very faint memories, they're young memories of my great grandma. And I was really little when I would be visiting her, or she when she was caregiving for me. So I can't quite remember words or anything like that. But my grandmother's generation, if she spoke, I never heard words like, such as maybe around my great grandma when I was with her, I would hear things that I didn't understand because it wasn't in English. But my grandma, I don't ever remember that happening. So I don't know if she spoke or if she just hid it and she didn't speak it in front of me or her children, my mother's generation. My mother's generation does not speak. And then for my generation, that carried on from stemming from, just speak English. That's what they want you to speak. Don't worry about these words I'm saying. Don't worry about what I'm speaking. So I think what I would comment on language, it is very important. Language revitalization is important. And I want to go back and learn my language too, as well. And I was really inspired by our Wampanoag relatives, because there's a documentary and they have a prophecy and they brought the language back. So there's a beautiful documentary about that too. I wish if I could remember it, we'll put it in chat. I think she's called Jessie, I want to say Jessie Little Doe Bird. And the story of Wampanoag Nation's prophecy, it's in the documentary called We Still Live Here. And maybe I'll try to get the link over to Kia. There's a discussion after the movie with Jessie Little Doe Baird, I think I'm pronouncing her name wrong, that tells you how like the dream came to her and they said, you're going to bring your language back to your people, basically. And I think she was intimidated by it, but she embraced it. She eventually embraced it. She went through MIT. It sounds like she knows a little in the documentary, and she brings it back. And the part I love about this documentary, not only does it give hope that your language doesn't have to be dead after your last speaker dies, but that, our people and our ways, they stand. For me, just like our ceremonies, they stand and they do what we're there to do. They do what they were intended to do, whether that's bring rain or heal the land. When the ancestors talk to you in a dream and say, we want you to help bring the language back, she did it. She went to MIT. She came to the whole council and gathered them. And in that part of the documentary, she says that was the first time that you have all the different bands, or I forgot what their different groups of their tribe are called, but everyone's gathered at the table, all the representatives, right? And they agreed. She said they never agree on anything, but when she said, do you want your language back? They all said yes. It was so beautiful. So that's what I'd like to share about language, just so we can remember our relatives that have done it, to know we can do it too. And just as Aspen was saying, the revitalization programs and initiatives and movements, everything that's being done now, wherever you are, if you're near a local tribe that is doing language revitalization, support that. Because the other thing we see happening is when there's, let's say, a meeting place to have that revitalization, the government then comes, seizes the land illegally, or they'll claim it's legal, so that there's no longer the meeting place. And when you take away the meeting place where people are meeting to do the language learning, now you have to find a place where everyone can meet. It's part of trying to keep that from happening. So I do hope that folks will recognize that and support the programs for language revitalization. Alan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can add to this. So growing up, I was trilingual. I spoke our traditional language, Spanish, and English. Check that out. And that was from birth until 5. And those 3 languages were spoke freely in the house. Now remember, when I told you originally, we lived on and off the reservation until I was 5. Once we moved after I was 5 years old, overnight, literally, we stopped speaking the traditional language. Because remember, my grandma told me, inside the house you can say you're Indian, but outside you don't. So I had to take away that. And then when I went to school, because it was a boarding school, I was not even allowed to speak Spanish. And it was kind of crazy because that was the dominant population in the area. I mean, there was like one or two black families, and then there was us, the only Indian family, and then everybody else was Mexican, Hispanic, you know. However, it was a really, really weird area, and agribusiness was huge in the location. So then English became the dominant language. So when I went to boarding school when I was 5 years old, right, and I'm starting off with this whole thing, I had to learn how to like get rid of like 2/3 of the languages that I grew up speaking. Totally bizarre. Now my grandmother died of Alzheimer's, and when she passed away, as she was fading, she stopped speaking English, and it was really weird because slowly and slowly and slowly, her language would start going from English to Spanish mixed, and then English, Spanish, and then there was like this whole other dialect, and everybody kept saying, "What the heck is she saying?" And one of my aunts was saying, "Oh, she's saying gibberish." And then it wasn't until one of my aunties said, "Oh no, she's speaking her language." And so as my grandmother was passing away, she forgot Spanish and English and only spoke her traditional language. And it was so sad because she was trying, I remember her crying, trying to teach me to remember what it was, you know, and how to speak certain words and things, you know, because she knew that I would, you know, pay attention to her. And I lived with them, you know, so, you know, that was what I did. And it was, I remember her crying, you know, just trying to make sure that somebody knew something, and, you know, saying a word and pointing at the door, you know, or saying a word and pointing at the cat, you know, all these kind of simple, really dumb things that we take for granted that she was doing. And when she passed away, it was kind of sad, you know, because the family felt like, you know, there was this whole, you know, loss that was there. And when I went to work, where I'm at, you know, there's a big language program, and we, you know, fight, you know, tooth and nail to make sure that it stays in place and it continues. And we work really hard to keep that in place. But again, I now get to see language becoming politicized, because I see, you know, oh, if you can't speak certain words in your language, you're not Indian enough, you know, or you're not Indian because you don't know how to say certain things, or you can only say, you know, these words, or you only know so much, you know. So it also has this whole political position, you know, from Indian versus Indian that's there. And it goes back to that urban versus res Indian, you know, dialect as well. It's like, you know, if you're not from the reservation, you're not enough Indian. And it's really, really strange, because I know, like, one of my colleagues that I work with is less Indian than me, you know, by blood, but on paper he's more Indian because of the federal status, you know, that I have to kind of deal and navigate with even to this day. I mean, I'm still fighting my mom's battle from my grandmother to get back our land allotment, to get back our little portion, you know, was it like a quarter acre or whatever it is now, from on the reservation, still waiting for a response from my mother. And she passed away, that she filed when my grandmother was alive. And this is the third generation. I'm waiting for that phone call from the BIA to get it reprimanded and corrected. This is ridiculous. So the language is the land is the language and land are the people. That's it. That's the summation. Those are circular, those are embedded, those are there. You take away the land, you take away the language, you take away the people. So that's the natural resource. The natural resource is the people, the natural resource is the land, the natural resource is the language, because without that, you have nothing. There's no way instead of it. And like I said at the beginning, when I introduced myself, I was actually just saying, you know, hello, we are the people, you know, to everybody. And I said it in 3 different languages, just, you know, just that much, in recognizing the people and the places that I come from, as well as the adopted families. So it's important even to have that little bit, even to have that little much. But, and from an academic perspective, it's really weird because I get to see the whole politicizing of the language just to make sure that Indian versus Indian is there. So it's like that I don't want to say greed, but it's almost that to that point in certain areas and certain sectors. And it just keeps, the have and the have-nots, but now it's the Indian have and the Indian have-nots. And it's all then based around identity. Very, very, very fascinating. That's all I have to contribute.
Yeah, I want to, I know we have a question in the chat, and I want to get this, and then we'll get to that. When my grandfather, my Tigwa grandfather, was dying, and he was in the hospital before we brought him home for hospice. And when I came the one day, my aunt was like, "Oh, he's just in there talking gibberish." And I went in, and he was not. He was speaking his language, and he was in that part, if you've ever experienced when people are dying, where he was seeing ancestors and relatives in the room, and he was talking to them, and he was ready to go home. And it was the only time I have ever, now learning Southern Tiwa, I learned that academically. I learned that with books, and grateful that archaeologists and anthropologists had done a whole lot of work on that language and people, but to have that experience, and it was the only time, because he as well, even though that grandfather was raised on his reservation in Isleta, and we have a lot of relatives there. Once they moved to Los Angeles, and there's a different whole conversation, that there was a period of time when there was this huge migration to certain cities, and then they weren't Indian, and they weren't Mexican, and they were Chicano, and they were this, and they were that, and so that's other layers. And this, what we're talking about language, and the question that's in the chat about what are our relationships with our ancestral tribes. So I want to remind us that what we are doing, these are unlearning conversations. So what you've heard a lot from what Alan was just saying, that there's this division, this pitting Indigenous people against Indigenous people. Whether it comes to, do you know the language? Do you live on a reservation? Do you this, that, or the other? What are your relationships to your ancestral tribes? And so I'm gonna do a little unlearning here before. And so first, like we as 21st century urban Indians, because every one of us, lives in an urban environment, we have to do a lot of work on not judging each other by these colonial standards, because these were not Indigenous standards or modalities of like, well, how many relatives and how many grandparents do you have, and did you live there? Did you travel every year and live on that in the spring camp? Because if you didn't, you're no longer Indian, right? Alan's story. And so it is a very colonial question to say, what are your relationships first? And the use of ancestral. So like, we're all living, breathing people whose grandparents were living, breathing people. This is not a long, long ago story. This is a now. And I'm going to invite my co-facilitators and our guests to think about how we want to answer that question or not answer that question. Because answering that question in a certain way is falling into the colonial, well, I have to give you my credentials, and I have to tell you my blood quantum, and I have to tell you my connection. At the same point, as Aspen has said, and is why we're doing what we're doing, is to share these stories and to educate. So for me, this is one of those moments of really having to do some discernment and some thought of how much is sharing and educating and building community, and how much is checking off some boxes to fill those quotas, to make it acceptable that we are the people talking about these things, right? So if we're talking about that question, and I'm not saying, Pat, that you're asking that question in that way, but if we're saying that the Indigenous people today are answering that question in the spirit of, are we Indigenous enough to be leading conversations? Are we Indigenous enough? Do we have deep enough relationships? I'm going to say we're not going to answer a question in that spirit, because that's the unlearning for today. Is like that it's, and I would the unlearning next part would be to ask you all not to ask that question again, right? Like the same of, well, where do you really come from? It's along those lines. And if we're learning as Unitarian Universalists and non, to do anti-oppressive and anti-racist ways of being in relationship and asking questions, that's along those lines. And because we are a community here, each of my relatives gets to answer that question and address it where they're at today. So I do see Aspen's ready to address it.
So to address that, it's a double-edged, sword for me, because unlike my other facilitators, their relatives are in what we now know as the United States for the most part. But my relatives are on my grandfather's side are from southern Mexico. So this is an entirely different culture. And the thing is that I am probably mixed with far more south of the border natives, if we're going to use those terms, than on this side of Turtle Island. And the problem that arises with us who are of Latin American descent, who have relatives that come from that area, is that we instinctively know, like 99% of all Mexicans are natives. To what degree we know what native, we don't, because thanks to the supremacy of the Mexica Azteca people prior to the arrival of the Spanish, there were many different tribes, but the Mexica acted as imperialists and assimilated other people into their way. And so, for instance, like all Mexican indigenous languages are Nahuatl or a Nahuatl language. So, but the particular people from where my grandfather comes from would be the Mixteco people, would be the Chichimeca and all those people. But thanks to Mexica supremacy and the co-opting of the Chicano movement, my people and other people who may have been raised in these traditions do not get to identify themselves this way, because everyone is just Aztec, and that's not the case. There are many nations, like the farther south you go, like on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, all of that is Mayan land as you get into Guatemala, and they speak entirely two different dialects. They speak Cochi and they speak Mam. So, like, let's say you go to Guatemala. Guatemala is an interesting place because I had a friend who went there. Guatemalans do not primarily speak Spanish. The first thing you would ask, like, they'll see me, I'm brown skinned, they won't ask me, do you know Spanish? They'll ask me if I know Cochi or I know Mam. Because everyone there, even though they're Guatemalans, are Mayans. Like, they still practice their Mayan traditions and they still speak their language. So, like, in Latin America, 12 million native people still speak their native language as their first language. And that is a big problem that we are facing. But I could go on and on about this, because it just, this perspective is not mentioned in American United States indigenous people, because my people and my relatives are still fighting the colonizer directly in a way that is decimating our culture, our land, and we are still trying to be recognized, because indigenous people in America, they do have a lot more rights in terms of indigenous people in Latin America, because indigenous people in Latin America are not recognized. There is no recognition, and there is no state apparatus saying, well, we're going to try to make it available for you guys to learn your language. We're going to try to make it available, documents in your language. No, if you don't know Spanish, then you're out of luck, because the government does not care. So now I'll invite Sam to speak next.
Sure. I think I'll just be brief. So along the lines of what Kia was sharing too, and thanks, Aspen. I appreciate everything you shared. I really would love to also hear what Alan has to share. What I will say is, when I wake up in the morning and I acknowledge Mother Earth, and I acknowledge my ancestors, and I acknowledge this land, the Kumeyaay and the land herself, I am honoring my ancestors. I am in relationship with my ancestors. I'm remembering who I am. Even if I don't know my language, I do that with a good heart. And my ancestors see that. And I know for me, that is part of being Indigenous. And when we think about this, we can think about it as well as what is the stereotype of Native peoples, right? Because the concept of relationship to your ancestors, does that get defined by somebody outside of you as an Indigenous person, or does that definition come from within you? Who's the right party to do that, so to speak, or how should that be looked at? So we kind of have still these elements that we're going through as part of when we talk about today Indigenous identity and the language connected to Indigenous identity and these complexities with just Indigenous identity being Native in the United States of America with tribes where the border crossed the tribe didn't cross the border like what Aspen's mentioning. So I think we have to open and understand that relationship is not just maybe a few things I can write down on a list, right? It's what we embody. For me, it's the way I live. How am I living the way I was taught? How am I honoring my ancestors? How am I going about my life? I'm supposed to be going about, right, in a way of living life to be a good human being. And I believe that's original instructions in almost any spiritual teaching, no matter what the name of the religion is. Yet with Indigenous people, somehow this gets lost of, it's kind of invisible, like, are you Native, are you connected? What is that connection? And all I can say is for me, it's honoring the way I was taught. And we have this saying, right, in ceremony, that they have this saying that we get reminded of frequently because we don't want to forget. And the saying is, don't play with these ways. Don't play with these ways. Why? Because these ways are real. They're real. The medicine is strong. It is real. The ancestors are real. So we come to ceremony, we know you come in a good way, you conduct yourself in a good way, and you come with that open heart and open mind, and you don't come to, like, say, show off, because that would be playing with the ways, right? You don't come to try to do harm, because that would be playing with the ways, and there are repercussions spiritually for that will manifest physically in your life. So what does it mean to be in relationship then? For me, it's knowing and remembering the protocol, remembering the way that I'm taught, honoring it. And I have to say, in an urban Indian setting, the other thing that has been huge for me is that it's an intertribal world, right? It's not like I'm not going around going, okay, you're not you. I can't associate with you. Oh, Aspen, you're not. Alan, you're not either. I am so happy as an urban Indian to see another Native, and we have little things sometimes we wear, right? Or ways we talk, the ways we greet each other that we know, hey, are you Native? Just by the way the person is acting or what they're wearing or how they're speaking to me. Like, yeah, are you Native? Yeah, and shake hands, say hello, because it's this recognition, like, okay, I see myself, and I don't get to see that every day. I don't get to see that in the media. Look at the media right now. Look at the dominant anything, the dominant news feed. Go look at the grocery store at the shelves and the magazines, and you're just gonna see Barbie, Ken, and Skipper practically. It's the whole gang, like, that's not a message to me affirming me that the first people of the land. That's the message of white supremacy. That's the message of something that has nothing to do with me. So what does it mean to be in relationship? It means for me as an urban Indian, it also means we look for intertribal settings and we come together in unity. We don't trip on what tribe you are, what blood quantum, at least not in the intertribal settings, which sometimes are called multi-tribal settings, that I hang out in. It's not like that. It's very loving and welcoming and affirming of us as tribal people. And I remember one time I was talking to Alan, and he said, like the urban Indian experience, people forget it is an Indian experience. And I said something like else, like the multi-tribal experience is what kept it keeps our traditions alive. It has kept and still keeps our traditions alive. So like these urban Indian centers, that's where I would hang out when I was in college and sing with the ladies, with my siblings. We just come together like that, and and if we get asked to go sing at a powwow, then we go because the people asked us. If we're at a ceremony and you're asked to sing, then you sing. If your gift is singing and the people ask for you to sing for them, you sing for them. That is what is community. That is relationship. So it's so complex. I don't know. For me, it's kind of hard to break this down in a multicultural group because of the complexities of Indigenous identity. But hopefully that helps with that question about, what is your relationship with the ancestors? We're many nations, right? But I can go anywhere as a people. For example, before I came down here to go to college, my relatives in Sacramento, we did a ceremony so I could be sent off in a good way. Prior to that, they got the names of Native people at Cal State San Marcos, and they said, these are Indians that are there. You need to go meet these natives. These are their names. These are their phone numbers. They had already talked to them. So our people make way for each other. So when I come down, they're not like, what nation are you? Are you Indian? They already know I'm coming. And it's like, hi, I'm Sam. Our relations up north where I come from asked me to connect with you. I'm like, okay, let us know whatever you need. If you get confused in this university, you let me know. This is what I do. This is how I can help. And, relative, welcome. Welcome to Listeño and Kumeyaay land. Welcome. So that was beautiful. That's our way. So what is relationship? It's when we interact with each other, honoring our ways. It's when I see my relatives on the road one time. It just happened when I was traveling back up to Sacramento, and I see you fighting. Like, hey, what's going on? How are you? Is everything all right? Well, no, we're arguing. The kids want cookies. We don't have enough, and we're just trying to figure out food. I'm like, well, hey, I'm going up to Sacramento. I know it sounds like you're going in a different direction, but I got food in my car. Here, I got a bunch of grocery bags, and I separated it, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Will you help me? We'll pop the hood. What would you like? I got plenty. I'm going to go to my family, and they're going to buy more food. They're going to take me to the grocery store. That's the first thing they're going to do when I show up. So what would you like? And don't be afraid. You take as much as you want, relatives. What would the kids like? I got these cookies. Would they like these cookies? Try these. You want some bread and peanut butter and make sandwiches? Like, whatever you want, please. I'll get you a bag. Here's an empty bag. Fill it up and tell me if you need, here's another one. That's our way. That's relationship. That's honoring our ancestors. So when we ask a question, what is our relationship to our ancestors, our ancestral land? It's the way we are. It's the way we're living. It's the way we're being to each other. And it's how I start my day for me, saying, good morning, Mother Earth, and acknowledging my ancestors, the land. I hope that helps. And Alan, I would love to hear if you would contribute, if you're open to contributing to answering this question about what is our relationship to our ancestral land.
Connection to ancestral land. Okay.
Ancestral tribes. I'm so sorry. What is your, let me read it to you. I'm sorry, Alan, to interrupt you. What are your relationships with your ancestral tribe?
I'm gonna take it one step further from you, Sam. Because when I got to college, the first kid in my family to go to college, and I bumped everybody, right? I went all the way through and got a freaking doctorate. And I remember giving it to my mom because I didn't want to accept it. And I danced in my regalia because I wanted to be a dancer. But my uncle said, no, that's not your way. And I remember crying because they said, you have to go on and be a teacher. You're gonna be an educator, and you're gonna go to school, and you're gonna do that, and then you're gonna come back and share all that stuff. And that's what you're gonna do, because that's your role, that's your job. And I remember getting really, really, really mad at my uncles for that, because I wanted to be a dancer. I wanted to be a powwow dancer. And it was funny because at one point then my mom said, you're freaking Californian, dude. Powwows aren't even from here. What the hell are you thinking? Sorry, excuse my language. but sometimes my mom was pretty crass. And I said, well, that's what I want to do. That's that's where all the cool kids were, right? That's what I wanted to be, and it was something totally different than everybody else. But I didn't even experience or get into any of that until I went to college. And like I said previously, my college experience, the college was bigger than the whole town that I grew up in, and that was the bulk of my life. And that was the first time I saw somebody that was blonde hair and blue-eyed, and fair complexion. And it totally bummed me out because I was just like, where is everybody? I had no one that I could connect with. And my mom dropped me off in the corner of my dorm, waved her hand and said, have a good life. Don't write until you find work, and she took off. She threw all my stuff out on the corner and she took off. Later, I had asked her, and she said that was the hardest thing she had to do, but she knew that if she stuck around, I was not going to get on my own 2 feet, and I had to do it. And she wanted to see what was going to happen. But I was there at college, and I bumped into a teacher who said, oh, you're that Indian kid. I was like, how the heck do you know? And he said, come on, I wanted to go show you something. And he took me to the Indian Tribal Center, where the kids were, or all the college kids. And I looked around, and I was like, here you guys are. And it was just like a homecoming. It was like no big deal. It was just like all of a sudden we were there. There was only like a dozen of us, right, in this whole big campus. But it was like all of a sudden there was the community. And then, and then my uncles gave me permission to start learning to sing, and I was like totally into it. And then, my other cousins were dancing, and it was cool for them to do so, right? So I wanted to be a dancer too, right? And I was singing, I was dancing, and we were doing all this stuff. And then in between, when you weren't singing and dancing, you had to go take care of the people, and that was your job. And you had to go take the elders their food. You had to go help them with whatever was going on. If they needed a ride, if they needed anything whatsoever, that's what you do. No matter day or night. And when I went to college, then I was getting my doctorate. My mom and dad moved back to the res. Well, my mom married later, so I call him my dad, even though he's not biologically my dad, but he's my dad. And they moved back. This is hard. And they needed to have the horses being taken care of. My mom raised horses. That's what she wanted to do. She said they were her big dogs. And she was dying at the time, and I didn't know this. And I had to drive back at least one day a week, if not 2 to 3, to go take care of the horses for my mom and my dad, help them out on the res, or near the res. They were like right on the border. And it conflicted with one of my classes, and it was the only F I ever got in school. And the teacher, I remember, he said, I'm failing you because you don't put up and give up anything that's happening. And I remember, being just torn and devastated that I was getting a failing grade. I felt like I was letting the family down, because they told me, I could not go on with what I wanted to do because that was my job. And I felt like I was letting down my family. And the professor who failed me, I remember staring at him and saying, how dare you, dude? It's like, you're giving me the choice between taking care of my family and taking care of my elders and coming to your damn class. Excuse my language. It's like, I bust my hump to do all the extra work, and I see all of these other kids sitting around drinking espresso and complaining that they don't have enough time in the library. It's like, and I'm driving back and forth 3 hours, at least twice a week, riding the horses in the morning before I come to your classes and everything, and you're going to fail me? You're going to make me choose between my family and this education? How dare you? And that was hard. But I remember as my mom was dying, everything that she said about, you take care of the family, you take care of your elders, you respect them. So even though I don't get a chance to pray, even though I don't get a chance to go to ceremony or to those things, like I used to when I was growing up, I had to remember that the way they gave me, that's what I have to do. And that's how I respect them. That's all.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing that really personal and emotional story. And you know, that is also part of the systemic stuff. And
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, I've talked at certain UU things when we've there was a regional assembly and we were supposed to do something. We were a little bit late, the group I was working with, and I came in and I said, we're late because it's Indigenous time. And I'm going to tell you what that means because it's not a joke. Like, we had a member of our team who suffered a loss in the family and learned like 15 minutes before the session was supposed to start. People before process, we needed to be with her until and then once we got her in a good spot, then we were going to come and do the work. And y'all were going to wait or not wait, but we weren't going to make her wait. So yeah, I know, Pat, you've been so patient in letting us have this part of the conversation, and we'd like you to talk now.
Well, actually, when I raised my hand, we were talking about language, and I had it. I'm not sure it's appropriate now. I mean, these heartfelt stories that, you know, it seems kind of, I don't know, off the mark somehow. But I was in New Mexico, and this teenage girl was showing, it was part of a program showing us around, and she said, if it weren't for the Indian school, and this just so shocked me, I wouldn't know my language or my ceremonies. And I wanted so badly to say, what? I thought the Indian schools were the opposite. I thought they tried to squelch the language and the ceremonies, but evidently this is a modern thing. And I don't think she was talking about a boarding school either.
Right. I think that's part of the there's a difference in language. There's residential schools, and then there are now Indian schools run by the nations, run by the individuals, where they are teaching the languages, the culture, the arts, that kind of stuff. So there is the use of the word. I try to use residential school when talking about that versus Indian schools.
Yeah, I have nothing but horrid negative images at residential schools. And so when she said that, but I was afraid to ask questions. I don't know why I was exactly afraid. I thought she might feel like I was criticizing something that it was important to her and that she was finding something good from. But I was dying to know, what in the world are you talking about? Because this is, you know, I mean, all these dead children and awful things that happened, and, you know, being punished for speaking.
Right. Yeah, anyway. Definitely a very different thing was happening, because residential schools were very specifically cutting Indigenous youth from their culture, from their language, you know, cutting their hair. They weren't allowed, they were dressed a certain way. There's, you know, a lot of we know a lot about that. But I think what we don't as a whole know is that a lot of communities are creating Indian schools to teach those things. So it's kind of the, I don't even want to say it, but like the antidote to that, right? Is we you know, like the song I played at the beginning was Know Better, Do Better. So we, you know, being able to, and again, there's like so many layers of what does it take for a tribe, a reservation, a group of Indigenous folk, what resources to be able to put together a school where they are teaching their community the language and the dances and the all that stuff. And I see Aspen wants to jump in.
Yes. So the thing about Indian schools and the difference between residential schools is, in this country, residential schools did not last as long as they did in Canada. The Canadian government was still forcing Indigenous First Nation people to go to residential schools as early as the early 90s. So the graduates and students of that are probably around the age of between the ages of 40 and 50 as the youngest. They weren't, by then there was a little more changes, but it's still terrible. But yeah, there are people that, are parents, people that are my age, I'm 22, their parents in the First Nations in Canada went to residential schools, were forced to be there, and they were assaulted and all these other horrible things. And the thing about that is Indian schools are across the Indian country and our native Hawaiian relatives. We've been pioneering these programs on the res that are solely ours, where we're not asking the BIA or any Indigenous, any like government apparatus for Indigenous folks to teach on our reservations, because res schools have traditionally had white people who were going to come from the res, and they were going to go and stay and live there. They lived on the res as a part of the BIA's education initiatives. But nowadays it's not that way. I mean, there probably are still some who teach there that moved onto the res to teach, especially like in the Navajo Nation. A lot of the overlap, especially with Mormons, a lot of Mormon missionaries were often given, like a professor of mine, her uncle was given property on the Navajo reservation. And so she grew up partially, a white woman grew up partially on the res with the Navajo Nation in Utah. So that is still a common thing. But to address, there is a large difference. And to just touch about on language, we were trying to revitalize. I know, like in South Dakota and North Dakota, the Dakota peoples have managed to get their languages taught in the public schools after years and years of fighting. And the thing is that this is not a popular opinion, but I am in favor for both non-natives and natives learning the language. The part of decolonizing is learning to communicate in a language of the land that you're living in, to know that the land, that you live on had a language prior to you coming here. And I always go back to what my chairman says, we need to remember who we are, because we were all Indigenous people once upon a time. But due to the Christianization of Europe, our peoples were forced to become, the Europeans they are today. But, all people start out as children of the earth. And, hopefully one day we can get back to that, to where tribal affiliation will not just be about your blood or where you're from, but it'll be that we're all human beings who understand that at one point we all took care of the land and that we all need to come back. But yes, I'll invite others to share now.
I just, want to make sure any of our guests who have anything they'd like to ask, or as we're getting towards the end of the second hour here, if you haven't had an opportunity, we want to give it now.
So
Hey,
I
I go. Is that going to be a problem?
You want to, Dan had started. You want to?
please go ahead, Alan.
Yeah.
Oh, all I was going to say is I need to leave. I'm sorry.
Oh, you meant you need to
Oh.
go.
Well, then let me thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Alan, so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Sam.
Okay, Alan, thank you.
Bye.
All right, Dan.
Bye.
So yes, I'll be more thoughtful and raise my hand before just small group.
You're good.
now.
Yeah, you're good.
I now I'm not saying anything I think that most people on this call already know, but I appreciated so much hearing the honest conversation or sharing of what a struggle it is to unravel one's ancestry given the effects of colonization on relationship. The fact that, well, am I now only half Indian because, you know, the colonizers have decided what I am. And I think that's part of what makes it more difficult for me to it's like almost the best way to ask a question is simply to listen, right? And if because the answer is in the answer really was in the story. I'm so grateful. The first time I understood, well, I won't tell a story about my own past, except to say that my mother's generation was not encouraged to learn Swedish. And of course, you can tell by my skin color, we were able to assimilate. We were able to pass very quickly. Yeah, it takes a while to accept the injustice and the privilege that comes with that. And my sisters, I haven't decided to do it, but my sisters have retired. I haven't. They're learning Swedish now. I love them dearly for that. I think that's all I'll say for now. Thank you again, everyone who shared.
Awesome. I do see Michelle's hand up, and before we go to you, Michelle, yeah, when I learned about, so I have a story about my German grandmother we also passed as Catholic instead of Jewish. And when I got to a certain point in my early 20s with this reality that both maternal sides had passed to survive, I had a lot of issues I had to work with because there was a lot of privilege in being able to do that. And so, yeah, definitely an interesting, like a conversation for another day. And Michelle, we'd love to hear from you again.
First, please say thank you to Alan. He got me crying. One, the privilege thing, wow, because isn't it that all of us are bits and pieces of so many, and so many of us pass without knowing, and some of us have like connections, some of us don't. But when we bought our property, when we bought our house and paid it off, I suddenly realized I owned Cherokee land. And that made me so, because it just, wow, I never even, thought of that. But I find it so interesting because I discovered that the Cherokee Nation, the Western Tahlequah, was doing the Cherokee language online, and that's how I started taking it with Ed Fields, and I will be going on and doing more. And he's wonderful because he's one of the elders, and he is one of the native speakers whose parents were both native speakers, and he also tells us stories. He's wonderful. But I find it so interesting that the timing of when so many of the nations are finally getting to the point where they're reclaiming their language, their culture, setting up ways to pass this on to the next generation and ensure that their children and grandchildren are still here and will survive and will remember who they are, and that there are groups that are finally getting together and realizing that blood quantum and however else you're counted is not about who they are, but about what the colonizers put on them to also try to, the United States, this is a way to obliterate groups of people that they signed long-term pacts with and treaties with the intention of putting them on blocks of land and letting them die. And it's like, as soon as, like, so many of the Iroquois nations are now getting their languages back. Even what is it, Fox and Sac, is they found people that still know enough and they're rebuilding that. And yet what comes up at the same time on top of that is another wave to try to take away voting rights, identity rights, and undermine. And I live in Tennessee, and I grew up overseas my entire life because I'm a military brat and I speak other languages. I didn't have part of my roots, and coming back here, it blew me away. I'm gonna get sad too, like, because you don't think who you are, but when I came back here, I knew who I was in that way. And I'm strawberry blonde, white skin, blue eyed, well, green eyes. And I'm also related to so many people that walked here and died here and lost his land. And I really appreciate you guys doing this. I loved hearing all of the stories and hearing about you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to try to invite some friends, or at least let them know, because I have other friends who are part of, different nations, and we're all like, we know each other, but they don't really connect, because the same thing, you can walk downtown Atlanta and no one knows who you are, and yet that land used to be part of theirs, or the same in California and in New York, anywhere here, and South America. So, but thank you so much, you guys, all of you, thank you. And in Cherokee, Wado.
We're so glad you were able to join us, Michelle.
Yes, it's such an amazing conversation that we've been having. And I would like to just point out that in this process, the big takeaway that we should all take away is that the American colonial project, or the colonial project in general, has stripped us all of our cultures, all of our heritage. Some of us were Jewish, some of us were Catholic, some of us were religions that no one's even heard of because they died out. But we had to do that to assimilate. But at one point we all had our ways. Like, we just celebrate St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick assimilated the Irish into Catholicism. And so we now see our Irish relatives are reclaiming their language and their heritage successfully. And it's, that is the thing that I hope one day we can see. Our Eastern European relatives are also reclaiming their heritage and have been. Our Nordic relatives are doing that. So the Indigenous resurgence is upon us, and hopefully that can lead to a new paradigm.
Yeah, and we hope that these conversations, as we go on and invite in other of our relations across Turtle Island, can help to help that resurgence and that renaissance. So we're going to close up, and I want to, so all the resources that were in the chat and other things, they will be on our website, and we will also email out every week, all those things, so everybody has them, has access to them. One of the things that we close out, I'm going to read a poem, and then we're going to have some music, and you will see, if you continue to join us, that we will highlight modern Indigenous musicians and artists. And anytime I am quoting something, it is an Indigenous author. So interspersed into my story were two different poems. One was from Joy Harjo, that was called Remember. And then the second one was Palimpsest, which is from Deborah Miranda. And I'm going to close us with a third poem called A New Language. And then we're going to play a little song from our relative Buffy, the wonderful, amazing Aunt Buffy. And it, Aspen was just talking about Eastern Europe, and we want to recognize the situation that's going on with our relatives in the Ukraine. So it is an old song, but it's relevant. So the poem is A New Language by Cassandra Lopez. My words are always collapsing upon themselves, too tight in my mouth. I want a new language, one with at least 50 words for grief and 50 words for love, so I can offer them to the living who mourn the dead. I want a language that understands sister pain and heart hurt. So when I tell you, brother is the hook of my heart, you will see the needle threading me to the others, numbered men, women, and children of our grit spit city. I want a language to tell you about 2010's 37th homicide, the unsolved, a man that turned my city to number, sparking me back to longer days when ocean is the mouth of summer. Our shell fingers dive into sand. Searching, we find tiny silver sand crabs. We scoop and scoop till we bore and go in search of tangy seaweed. We are salted sun, how we brown to earth, our warm flesh flowering. In this new language, our bones say sun and sea, reminding us of an old language our mouths have forgotten, but our marrows remember.
There's this other song that I wrote back in the 60s, right? And like I said, there was
You guys, be safe, and as my people say, nawazam and yuet for all my relations. You are my relations. So, take care this week. We want to see you again.
That's right.
Thank you, relatives. I hope all my relations.
You're hanging on for a minute, right, Sam?
Sure.
Okay, it's just us now. Hang on, let me stop recording.
I'm going to stop the recording.